Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And for those who celebrate Christmas, you had a good one. And if not, we have the new year to coming up in a few days' time. But today we are venturing to India, North Africa, Italy, and beyond, and in a very personal story set during a terrible war. My guest, Leila Sen, has written this book, which is available in the link that's below. You can find it or in your local bookstore or via her website. She has written about her parents, and I'm delighted to welcome her in. It's morning where you are. How are you today?
Good morning, Paul. Or is it
Good.
good evening for you?
Evening for me, morning for you. Time differences. So, the interesting story. I mean, I love it when a guest comes on telling a personal story because you've obviously got that background information. But with a new guest, I like to ask people how they define themselves because your website, you've done poetry, you've done fantasy writing. How do you define yourself as a storyteller first? What label do you like?
Yes, I am a storyteller first, and you're right. I, strangely enough, I my my um, my writing is all about not just for children, for adults as well. But it's fantasy. It's about fairies and goblins and stuff like that. So this story has been a complete. A, a completely different direction for me. But it is a story that I really did need to tell. I realized my parents had such a wealth of history that they were going to take with them once they passed. That it was imperative. It was just a burning desire I had
Mm.
to. It took me 12 years of honing in on this kind of writing and doing the research and editing and re-editing. But I eventually got it out, and I'm very grateful. And I'm grateful to you, Paul, for having me here, and also to all those who've somehow made the time to listen in. Thank you.
Mm. Well, we've got lots of photos we'll be using tonight, but let's start off with an introduction to who your parents are and where they were when World War II started. And just before going live, folks, we were discussing that depending on where you are in the world, the war starts at a very different month, if not indeed year. I mean, from 1936 to 1941, depending on where you are. So introduce us to your parents and where they were. Then we'll kind of talk about what was going on at the time of the outbreak of war and the different kind of reactions to the war, because everybody watching this will understand that the interpretation of the war is often based on where you're from and who your loyalties are towards, and whether you consider yourself of your country first. Are you of your faith first? Are you loyal to your family first? So let's introduce you to your parents first.
Well, my father was Indian. He was born he was from Bengal. My mother was from the Middle East, and she was actually born in Turkey. Um, she was of Armenian, Coptic, and Greek descent. And my 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 both countries. She kind of domiciled in Egypt. She escaped. She was the only one of seven siblings who survived the Armenian genocide in
Mm.
Turkey, and she escaped with her parents and found a refuge in Egypt, where she was brought up. And my father, he was educated in Calcutta. He went through some of the best English medium schools and colleges. He passed through hair school, and then went on to Presidency College, and and he then trained as a doctor in Medical College, Calcutta. And once he had finished his training, he was ready to offer his services to his country and to the world. However, India was going through a strange time. There was this desire to get rid of the British, to achieve freedom, and all Indians really felt that way. But when the war came along, it was there was an ambivalence. In most Indians, there were a few diehards, but most Indians wanted the British out of the country. But when it came to fighting against a greater evil, they felt it was important to align themselves with the Allies, with the British, and fight alongside the British. And this happened during the First World War and the Second World War. My grandfather also fought with the British Indian Army in World War I, and also in Iraq, in the Middle East. And my father followed in his footsteps. So it was strange, because my father was fighting with the British in the Middle East, and yet his two younger sisters were marching in protests, freedom marches in India. So there was this kind of, but most Indians, I would say 90% of Indians aligned themselves with what they felt was the greater good.
Mm. And this is where we have these terms like the British Raj, for example, has all sorts of connotations, sort of negative and positive. And, your father there in the photos looks about as English as you can be. And he was the typical Englishman in some ways, sportsman and horses and all the things that are associated with that sort of aristocratic English life. And yet, as you say, the country does not want to be part of the British Empire, but at the same time, there are all these cultural things that they have taken on board and like. It's a complicated period for everybody, and that's why we're delighted to have you here to give your perspective. And your mother having from Armenian, her background, the understanding of persecution, the understanding of peoples wanting to take away your rights, and what level of loyalty you can show during that. So when you put the book together, how much did your father particularly express? I mean, I know you found his diary about did he have mixed feelings back then, or was his path to serving with the British Army, pretty straightforward? It was the obvious thing to do.
Could I read a little? Could I read
yes,
a small part
yeah.
of the book? Okay. Above all her dominions and colonies, the jewel in the British crown was India, so much so that the British sovereign was proclaimed not only King of England, but Emperor of India as well. It was the wont of the English to believe in all earnestness that India, the British Raj, was a legacy bequeathed them by their forefathers as an integral part of the British Empire, an inheritance the safekeeping of which was their destiny. Predictably, India believed otherwise. Howbeit, the tendrils of over 200, almost 300 years of intertwined history in some ways evolved both cultures, bringing changes to both nations. India had been fighting for independence for years, and for some intensely patriotic Indians, all was fair in war. Such a person was Subhash Chandra Bose, a young nationalist from Bengal who came from a well-to-do family and was educated in the best institutions in India as well as in England. There were other similarly educated intellectuals from affluent families, fiercely patriotic, and together they formed the INA, the Indian National Army, and opted to side with Britain's enemies. But most Indians took a larger view of things. Fighting for independence was important, but not at the expense of undermining the fight against a much greater evil impending the world. In fact, Gandhi had declared that India did not seek independence out of Britain's ruin. He believed in achieving it with nonviolence. I don't know how many people know of this, but actually Gandhi wrote a letter to Hitler telling him that he was the one person who could prevent humanity from descending into savagery. The letter was never delivered to Hitler by the British because they believed, and I think justly so, that it wouldn't achieve anything and it might only show be a sign of weakness. And so India decided to put aside its differences and align herself with Britain against the enemy. Not an easy decision, as the burning desire for freedom pitted patriotism against morality, causing friction and creating factions among good men. And so it was that Shanti Dutt, first born in the upper middle class family of Dr. J.P. Dutt, who also had fought in World War I in the Middle East with the British Indian Army. Educated in the finest English establishments Calcutta had to offer, Shanti passed from the hallowed halls of Hare School before crossing its playing fields where he excelled as an athlete to enter the hostel of Presidency College. That oldest and most august of institutions that bred, there were, others like the poet laureates Rabindranath Tagore, Narendranath Datta, who became the famed philosopher Swami Vivekananda. And with these esteemed figures as role models, Shanti matured into manhood. He then went on to finish his medical studies in Calcutta Medical College, where he also captained the Bengal basketball team to win the All India Olympics in 1937. After finally completing his training there as house surgeon, the young doctor was ready to offer his services to his country and to the world. But Shanti, like so many Indians, wrestled with a situation fraught with the demons of contradiction. It was not easy, threshing through one's loyalties in an effort to achieve the right perspective. Eventually, however, the priority of fighting for the freedom of the world had to take precedence over that of fighting for the freedom of one nation, even if that nation happened to be your own. Thus it was, for a second time and with mixed feelings, as she had done once before in World War I, India sent her soldiers of diverse cultures, creeds, and religions to fight in special brigades, regiments, and battalions in what was then known as the British Indian Army. They gathered from the four corners of Mother India, the largest volunteer force ever known, as 49 states fielded 2.5 million men, ranging from platoon and divisional strength, and each fought gallantly with an honor that upheld both name and heritage. In fact, Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, commander of the British Indian Army, reportedly stated that the British couldn't have come through both World Wars I and II if they hadn't had the British Indian Army. In these battalions and regiments, enlisted soldiers were all Indian. The officers were mainly British, with recently initiated a smattering of Indians here and there. And of this army of courageous men who answered the call of their country, almost 87,000 were never to return or see their homeland again. So that was the situation in India during the war.
Do you think because your father was a doctor, in some ways that made it easier, because as a doctor or even an orderly or a medic, you are to some extent you're neutral. We'll get on to his service in North Africa later on, where he's treating both, Allied prisoners and also wounded and also German prisoners. But it's not like he has to take up arms in that kind of direct way. So do you think being a doctor made it easier? You have to, as a doctor, you have to go where people need help. And
it might have.
People need help at the front line, don't they?
Yes, it's a good point. It might have. He carried a pistol, but he never had to use it.
Yeah.
In fact, the pistol is somewhere buried in the desert to this day, if somebody hasn't found it. But when the Germans, when they surrendered the Germans, he decided he was not going to hand his pistol over to the enemy, so he buried it in the sand. But I think you might be right. Although there were a lot of, when after he was captured, he went from the transit camp of Capua to Aversa, which was a camp only for Indian officers.
Mm.
So there were quite a few Indian officers who were fighting in all sorts of
Yep.
battalions,
Yep. Absolutely.
in the fighting battalions, in the medical, in the engineering battalions, so and regiments. Um, so I think maybe for him it might have been a little easier, but there were a lot of Indians who 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 were there, who did the fighting as
Oh,
well.
absolutely. Yeah. No. Of course. That's the result is that most of the 2.5 million Indians did take up arms and were actively combatants. But I think that yeah, the medical profession gives the the someone a bit more of a, not an excuse is not the right word, but you can explain your motivation by being
Yes,
dedicated to your to saving life. And the medics I knew who served in Normandy, they saw themselves in some ways as not neutral but kind of crusaders for saving life, albeit they were wearing the uniform of a particular army, but they saw themselves as sort of a separate from that. But let's go back to your father's story. So he's a kind of important part of Indian society in a sense. He's a sportsman. He's a doctor. He's privileged, I guess, would be a word to describe him to some extent. And then educated there, but
upper
also
middle class. Yes,
upper middle.
upper middle
Then
class. Yes.
going how. I mean, we could spend all day talking about every journey he made and every journey your mother made during their lives, but sort of summarize his route from Bengal through to eventually serving in North Africa, as we'll get to later on in the battles of El Alamein and Gazala.
Well, in November 1940, he applied to the IMS, the Indian Medical Service, and he received his orders from New Delhi, headquarters New Delhi, which sent him on to Pune, and he uh, his father had already been through the First World War, and he was not really very happy that his son was going to go through the same experience that he did, because he carried the demons of that war with him as well.
Mm.
But my father felt that it was something that he needed to do. He wrote something which, in a letter to his parents, he said this: "I have wrestled with the morality of this war and tried to fathom its reason, and I do believe it is a necessary battle that we are about to fight. In spite of the contrariness of my being an Indian in the British Army, I am convinced that in this instance I am on the right side, otherwise I should not be here." So that was his his belief. And so he, being an Indian, he did get his parents' blessing, and then he went and visited the temple, and he got the blessing of his gods and goddesses, and he got on a train and went to Pune, and that was his passage from being a man of peace to a man of
Mm.
war, kind of thing. In Pune, he went through, I think it was about 2 weeks of intense training, and then he was sent as a general medical officer to the hospital in Pune. This was in the collective camp at Pune, and at that camp, at about the same time, a battalion had arrived, the 2-4 Gurkha Battalion from the northwest frontier of India, and 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 my father, one day, he'd come off the playing fields where he had received a wound to his eyebrow and his forehead, a gash that had opened, and so he went to the infirmary, the MI room, and asked the medical orderly over there to stitch his wound. And in the MI room at that moment was a an officer, a British officer from the 2-4 Gurkhas. His name was Alistair Temple, but everyone called him Shirley because of his last name, Shirley Temple. So anyway, my father asked the orderly to stitch his wound, and the orderly was kind of aghast. He said, "Sir, I can't do it. I don't have the wherewithal." And my father said, "You have the needle, you have the gut, you have everything, He said, "But I don't have anesthesia." So my father decided, "But you hold the mirror, and I'll do the stitching." So the orderly held the mirror, and my father was stitching his eyebrow, and the orderly fainted, and Alistair Temple, kind of caught the orderly as he was fainting, and he went back to the battalion, and he told the adjutant of the battalion was John Masters, who later became a prolific author and wrote many books, one of which my father figures in, The Road Past Mandalay. And 2 of his books were made into movies as well. But anyway, Alistair went back to the battalion and told them about my father and said, "Look, we need a medical officer. How about this one?" So a couple of days later, my father found, received orders, and he walked into John Masters' office, and the adjutant was busy, and he said, "Good morning, sir." And John Masters kind of looked up and said, "Good morning. And what's your name?" So I can read this little bit as well.
Please do.
So my father came to attention and saluted, and Masters prompted, "Well, good morning, sir. Good morning. What's your name?" "Dat, sir." "Rank?" barked the adjutant. "Lieutenant IMS, sir." "Christian name?" There was a slight pause and a flicker of irritation in his brown eyes as Shanti replied, "None, sir." Masters looked up annoyed. "Look here, what in the blazes?" he sputtered. "I'm not Christian, sir," Lieutenant Dutt cut in stiffly. "I'm Hindu. I don't have a Christian name." For a split second, he glanced down into the adjutant's astonished eyes. The surprise was genuine, untainted by arrogance or prejudice of any sort. A hint of a smile twitched the corners of Lieutenant Dutt's mouth. He lifted his gaze respectfully. "I do have a first name," he offered with quiet satisfaction. "Shanti. Middle name Pada. Shanti Pada Dutt, sir." And from then on, Masters, he realized that however long a history he had with India, being in this kind of close proximity with another Indian on more or less equal terms,
Yeah.
was something that was new to all of them, including my father. And he went back to the Colonel Whelans of the battalion, and he said, "This one's a good egg, sir. I think we should have him as a medical officer." And that's how my father joined the battalion.
And that's a typical example of what your book does, which is these people are simply thrust together. They're thrust together from different nations, different religions, different class, different ages, but there is this single uniting factor that they are there to hopefully defeat this terrible enemy that are the Axis. And obviously there are moments of prejudice and understandings and cultural differences and all that would be associated with that. As anybody who's watching this knows, that the British Army and its allies in North Africa were beset with all sorts of, I say, cultural problems and doctrinal problems, and this is how you do it, oh no, this is how we do it. But eventually kind of everybody muddles through, and it becomes an experience that although there were these negatives within it, it did bring people together, didn't it?
It did. And the relationships kind of found their levels, I mean, they my father did have a couple of rub-ups, but they began to kind of adjust to each other, and there was a certain a certain respect that developed, and by the end of it all, they might not have been completely hail fellow well met, but there was a camaraderie that they did share for that had been forged in these really sometimes horrible situations that they had gone through. They had fought beside each other. They had supported each other. They had died beside each other. My father had people dying in his arms, British, Indian, even Germans.
Yeah.
There was one situation where there was this young German Panzer and a British Tommy lying side by side. It was almost in an intimate fashion, and the rapport between these two who had been enemies, the enmity had been forgotten because what they were facing together now was death.
Yeah.
And my father went through this, and it made a huge impression on him, an impression that they were demons that he carried way after the war. Even when I grew up, I was maybe up to the age of 17, 18. I witnessed some really terrible night terrors that my father went through, which I didn't quite understand then. I mean, it was only later that I began to realize that it was the memory of the war that would come back to him at night. So yes, they had British and the Indians. They in the different stratas of society, they found their own level of their relationships and their level of comfort.
And that's the thing about the army is that,
and respect.
At the end of the day, rank is what matters most. Is that if you've got a certain rank, it doesn't matter what the person you meet is. They can be a senior rank or a lower rank, but that matters more than, in some ways, color, nationality, race, religion. It's what the army instructs you to refer to the other person as. And as an officer within the Royal Army Medical Corps, he has that rank. So let's talk about North Africa, because that's your father is thrust into the North African campaign. We've covered at length on the channel, and it starts off with disaster after disaster of the Allies, and eventually comes through to the victory it became. But for a Royal Army medical person such as your father, it's just one busy day at the office to another. So tell us a bit about your father's duties out there and the units he served with and alongside out in North Africa.
Well, they arrived in Egypt in 1942, and it was. Let me see. It was. Let me have a quick look. Yeah. Yeah, they arrived in Egypt in April of 1942, and they got their orders to go to war in the desert. On the 25th of April, they entrained for Mirza Matruh, and it was a single track railway. They first went to the kennels. Of course, they made their way through. This was the first time that the battalion had been to the desert. They had very little training with the tanks, with the 2-pounders and the 6-pounders that they had in the desert. And so they were kind of thrown in, just willy-nilly.
In at the deep end, yep.
And excuse me, I'm fighting a bit of a cold and a sore throat.
Yeah, me too. Yep.
And they were, let me see, at Mushaifa, they loaded up and they went past Fort Madalena, and they went to the kennels, where they were to join the 10 Indian Infantry Brigade in the 5th Indian Division, under command of Brigadier C.H. Busha and Major General H.R. Briggs. Their brother battalions in the new brigade were to be the 2nd Highland Light Infantry, the HLI, and the 410 Baluch Regiment. This brigade came under 30th Corps, which, together with 13th Corps, would collectively come to be known as the British Indian Army. They had Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, who had been sent from Cairo to take command of the 8th Army, and he was headquartered in Gambut, and which is a little airstrip, approximately 300 miles from Cairo, and the battalion had to learn about jock columns and the usually they say that the war in the desert was very fluid. Almost like the war at sea. It kind of flowed. But this particular battle that they fought was more stationary. They had this long line of what they called boxes, which were there were no reference points in the desert, and so they had these for reference points. They had these boxes. It was along a 40-mile swath of landmines laced with barbed wire that stretched across the western desert from the coastal town of Gazala in the north to Bir Hakim, the Well of the Wise, in the south. It was bounded by the Mediterranean at its northern end and the intractable sand sea to the south. And the Gazala line was guarded at various points by keeps that were known as boxes. And each box housed a brigade that was a mile or two square in size, encircled first with barbed wire and then with mines. It was fortified with guns bristling out in all 4 directions, much like the quills of a vigilant porcupine. And a pathway was cut during the day for people to come and go, and at night, the pathway was mined so that no marauders or enemy patrols could get in. Yeah. And this was the final line drawn in the sand between the two combatants. And the other thing about the war in the desert that was different to maybe the war in many other parts of the world was that it was in the desert, away from civilization, and the combatants didn't have that the burden of civilians getting caught in the fight, the destruction of civilians and cities, and so there was also a different relationship between the combatants,
yeah,
to a certain extent, which was
it's unifying, as you said earlier. Whether you're German or British or
yes.
Indian, everyone's cold at night. Everyone's a long way away
Yes.
from home. Everyone is hot in the day, cold at night. Everybody's getting crappy food. Everybody's worried about the outcome, and so that's the uniting factor of that campaign, particularly is of the isolation. And so you rely on the military hierarchy to take you through. You rely on just doing your job, being the small part of the mechanism that you are, and getting on with it, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, when the British took when they took a drubbing, the first part of the Battle of the Cauldron, um, and uh, there was a whole lot of a whole lot of allies were captured. Rommel's army was stretched so thin by then that he actually he let a number of prisoners go because he didn't have enough food and especially water to give them. At that time, the German army was subsisting on bare bare minimum rations and food, and Rommel felt that, well, if I cannot feed or give food or water to the prisoners, he let them go, which would not have happened elsewhere, maybe, So there was that as well.
So let's talk a little bit about your father's duties, because, we've talked about the Royal Army Medical Corps and the extraordinary work they did at battles like Arnhem and Normandy. But North Africa makes everything even more challenging, like Burma does, because of even simple things like water supplies, because it isn't totally plentiful there, whereas it would be in other theaters. So explain what job did your father particularly do? Was he running an aid station? Was he running a clearing station, or did he move around from various duties? Obviously, he's attached to the 2nd, 4th Gurkhas, but explain a bit more about what his duties were, please.
Well, he was right there on the front lines, at the RAP, the regimental aid post, right there on the front lines.
Yeah.
So he was the first. Stop where the wounded came in, and they were kind of patched up willy-nilly as best they could be, and then sent back to the ADS, the advanced dressing station, and from there to the clearing station, and then on to, hopefully, to a hospital. So all he had was trenches that they had dug to put the wounded in. They were being shelled at the front. There was, I mean, it was dust, gunfire, people coming in with transportation that was being bombed on the way in or bombed on the way out, and it was, it was something that just he had never experienced before. He was sometimes faced with such terrible injuries, and mortality, that it shook him to his very being. But he sometimes doubted his own ability to handle it, and he had to really pull himself together and tell himself, whatever you feel, you have all they've got. And and it's, for example, it was these were people known to him, people that he had spent the last year and a half with, and they were injured, they were dying in his arms. He was kind of playing father confessor, friend, a deliverer, doctor, all rolled into one. And well, I mean, he I suppose he managed well enough, because he was given the military cross for it afterwards. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that alone says that he was regarded very well by his comrades to receive the military cross for this. And we're not going to go down the big analysis of the Battle of North Africa, because that's not why we're here. That's not why you're here, and we've talked about that at length. But we as viewers know that as 1942 progresses and you get to November, the things do turn in favor of the Allies. The Second Battle of El Alamein results in a victory for then Montgomery and the Eighth Army, and we go on to liberate Tunisia. But of course, for your father, of course, it was rather an opposite reaction, because he arrives when things were pretty bad in North Africa, getting better, but he ends up getting captured. So let's talk about that, and then I want to bring your mother back in and where she was as well. So let's talk about the next chapter, which is his time in the prisoner of war camp.
Well, my father got slightly injured, but I think he had a couple of cracked ribs from a narrow escape that he had from an air attack, and a wound to his hand. But luckily, that was all he had to deal with. The history books say that they were captured on the 6th of June, but my father says that the surrender actually began to take place on the 5th of June.
Right.
Whereas the soldiers had to start giving up and surrendering when two German soldiers approached his rap and demanded that he surrender. My father put his foot down and said, "No, this is a medical. This is a hospital, a medical station, and nobody here surrenders. Everybody here is equal. Whether it's the Allies or the Axis." So, and a German officer intervened, and the German soldiers searched the camp. That was when my father buried his pistol in the sand, and so they were left to continue. He told me of some really, there was for example, a lot of tank commanders would stand up in their tanks because their vision was not that good, and from inside the tank they would stand up, although they had been warned not to do that, and they would get their heads blown away. And my father had one young tank commander who came to him, and when he removed the bandage, he found that his brain was exposed, and the man wasn't breathing. And my father felt, well, there's nothing more I can do for him. But it was out of respect, he was putting the bandage on, and there was a slight pressure on his brain, and the man started breathing. And my father was absolutely flabbergasted. As a doctor, he thought this is not possible. But so he took his hand away, and the man stopped breathing, and he put his hand, very gently put pressure again, and he started breathing again. And that it kind of it humbled my father, but it also enraged him that these young men were going through this terrible trauma, and they were fighting to live, and their chances of living were so small with the dust and the dirt and the smoke and the and the rudimentary care that they were getting. In those days, of course, there were no helicopters that could fly them out. And so he just had to bandage him and hope for the best. Those are the kinds of things that he had to go through. But eventually, eventually, he had to give up, and he was captured. And they were taken to first they ended up in Derna, and then they were taken to I think was it Benghazi? Hold on a second.
No worries. We're hanging off every word. We're loving it. People are enjoying this a lot. Thank you.
I'm trying to get to that place. Hold on. Where am I? Well, there were a couple of really funny little anecdotes that the two British officers that I met while I was writing this book gave me about. I wonder if I could just
please do. Yeah, we want to hear that. Yes, please.
There was towards evening of that fateful day, Ben Brown was roaming the throngs of weary, disconsolate, and injured POWs. Amidst the devastation on the battlefield and the confusion that followed their capture, it was near impossible to tell just who had been bagged and who had managed to slip the net. As battalion adjutant, he was trying to identify, shepherd, and reassure those of the 2-4 taken captive, when suddenly out of the fog of smoke and darkness, an enemy tank materialized and advanced towards them. It rolled right up and stopped, ominously, not 10 feet from where he was standing. The turret hatch clanged open and a head popped out. Curiously, it peered around the crowd of woebegone prisoners, and after a moment was followed by the rest of its body. And then it spoke. "I say," a voice called in impeccable English, "any of you chapters here from Mill Hill?" There was a moment's astounded silence before a hesitant voice from the crowd replied, "I am." A pleased grin broke across the German officer's face. "Good show, so am I. Anyone for some hot coffee?" So that was their. Let me see. 8th June, 9th, they set out after being. They set out on the road, and they arrived at an Italian ADS. And from there, they were taken to Derna, the Derna prison, and then the hospital at Tamimi. And then they were taken to through the Jebel Akhdar mountains to the Benini airfield.
Yep.
And Benghazi and the Benina airfield, and they were put on a Savoia Marchetti, or is it Marchetti? Marchetti aircraft,
Marchetti.
And they were flown to Lecce. They were flown to Lecce, and they were put in a factory where they spent a couple of days. And then they were taken. Then the group was divided. Some went up to I think it was. They went up north, and my father was put with his group on a train with Robert Williams and Roger Werner, put on a train and taken to Capua, which was a transit camp, and it was the situation in that camp was terrible. They were all kind of thrown in willy-nilly. There were not enough. There were not enough bathrooms. There were not enough sanitation. There was not enough soap and water. So, but anyway, that's where they went. They went to Capua. There was a terrible. There was an escape attempt at Capua, and there was a war crime that was committed during that escape, where two of the escapees were shot. And my father was the medical officer. It was yeah, that was Capua.
Yeah.
It was it it was I think a Lieutenant Reeves who there was a Lieutenant Reeves who he was taken. He was not. He survived the shooting, but nobody was allowed to attend to him.
Mm.
He was then eventually taken to a hospital where he died the next day. Um, and from Capua, my father was then sent to Aversa, which was a camp for just mainly all Indian officers. The situation there was better, but um, it was, you know, they survived. They survived on on a meager amount of food, but
Mm.
mainly on the Red Cross parcels that would come
Yeah.
in. And there was some there was some Red Cross. The Red Cross parcels that went from the Red Cross were all authentic, but there were some parcels that were sent through other organizations, and they went they went through MI9,
That's right. Yeah.
um, and and they had um, things secreted into the parcels that helped with escape attempts, like invisible ink and and uh, uniforms that could could be
Yeah.
reversed into uh, clothes that look like civvies, and little kind of microphones in the buttons, foreign currency in playing cards, things like that. And and the prisoners of war were always, always trying to escape, one way or the other. Most were foiled, of course, but
But this is also a time where he's having to, like all Indians in this situation, they're once again questioning their loyalty and their long-term aspirations, because those who are watching this are familiar with the Indian doctor who was in Colditz, for example, who the Germans tried to turn him against his British comrades, and similar things were going on in this environment. Your father had signed, joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, the Indian Army, a few years earlier. Kind of perhaps he was a bit idealistic. He hadn't seen the world. He has now seen the horrors of North Africa. He's seen men die in his arms. He's seen people that he cannot treat, people that he has treated, and he's seen all aspects of war. And now he is in the prisoner of war camp. Did his motivate? Did he question his motivations at this point? Were there moments of internal turmoil about who he is and why he's there? Let's face it, he's the other side of the world at this point.
um, well, it not so much that, but there were a couple of instances. For example, there was some Muslim uh, officers and the other ranks
Yep.
who would have to pray 4 times a day, and they had a certain manner of praying. There were in the camp some British officers from purely British outfits with no Indians in their. They had no experience of being with anyone, but Britishers, and they thought it was very funny. So they would sometimes kind of indulge in raucous laughter and stuff like that. And the British officers who had fought in battalions with and regiments with Indians and other um, other soldiers from the colonies were very upset about this, and they made their feelings known to these. So I mean, there were those British officers who stood up for the the soldiers that they had, the
Yeah.
soldiers in the colonies that they had fought with. But I think it was still, for my father, it was not, excuse me, it was still very much a question of being us against them.
Yeah.
So, it was that part of being an Indian had been put aside.
Yeah. It's a short term ambitions rather than long term at this point. The short term is to end this war, defeat the Axis, and then
Yes.
India's future, I suppose, can be a bit further down the line. It's not that he's not thinking about it; it's just that, I guess, priorities, I suppose, is the word.
And yes, and you're missing home. You're among people, whether they're British or whether they're Indian. They're missing home as well, and you've been with them through battle. You've shared things with them that you cannot explain or ever share with anybody who's not been through it.
Yeah, yeah.
And that has created a certain bond. Of course, like I said, there were those who were not accustomed to foreign soldiers, and but the officers who'd fought alongside the foreign soldiers were also very indignant about it. So there was that bond had been formed.
I think we should talk a bit about your mother. We haven't mentioned her much yet, because obviously there's a letter on screen that your father wrote your grandmother, his mother.
Yes.
But what's happening back on the home front? Both your father's parents and your mother's family at that time.
Well, my mother was, like I said, she had settled down in Egypt. She had been married before, and she was divorced. She had 3 children. And my father, when he was in Iraq, in Basra, he had the unit was bivouacked near a school that was closed because of the war, and he had met this young Armenian teacher who was playing caretaker in the school, and she allowed him to use part of the school building for his casualties. And they got to talking, and that's how he first learned about her background, how she had also escaped from. She was my mother's cousin. How she the family, some members of the family had escaped from Turkey. Many of them had been killed. And when my father was leaving Basra, she gave him my mother's address in Cairo, and said, if you ever find yourself in the vicinity of Cairo and you have the chance, can you please ask her to contact us, because we've heard that Cairo and Alexandria have been bombed, and we haven't heard from her, and we're very anxious. And my father made her a promise. But by the time the battalion had gone through Iraq and then Syria, and then back to Iraq, and then to Iran, that they called Persia at the time, and back to Iraq. And then by the time he got to Egypt, he found, quite out of character, that he'd lost my mother's address. And he was horrified, because he'd made a promise to this lady who'd been so kind to him. And he decided that, well, a promise made is a promise that has to be kept. So he made up his mind that he was going to get into a taxi, and he was going to visit. He knew my mother was Armenian, and therefore so he decided that he was going to visit luckily he remembered the area where she lived, which was Shubra. And he asked the taxi driver, he said, take me to every church that you know in this area. And the driver thought he was kind of crazy, but he agreed to do that. And as luck would have it, the very first church that my father walked into was the church that was my mother's church. And he met the priest over there, Aziz Habib. And the priest, when he heard the story, was kind of taken aback. And he thought, but in those days, he was not about to give my mother's address to this soldier, and a foreign soldier at that. It was not done. But he realized that, this is such a strange story. He's lost the address, but the first church he walks into, there's no possible way that the story could have been made up. So he decided that he would take my father to meet my mother. And my mother was a person who she would, if something had to be done, she got it done, over and done with. My father, he was a doctor, and he kind of measured things a bit, and then made his decision. But he met my mother, and completely out of character, he fell in love with her. And he did struggle with the impossibility of the situation. Completely different cultures, different countries, and in those days, for an Indian to marry somebody who been married and divorced and had 3 children it really was very, very uncommon. And so he was kind of having these arguments with himself back and forth. But when he got when the battalion was given the orders to go into war, he decided that he was going to ask her to marry him. But he didn't have the chance to do it firsthand, so he approached the priest Aziz Habib, and he said, would you tell her? He was rushing off into the desert. He couldn't explain to them that we're going to war, because that was classified. And so he asked Aziz Habib, would you ask her to marry me? And the priest was very reluctant. He said, no, don't put me in this kind of situation. My father pleaded with him and said, look, you're my only hope. So anyway, my father went into battle. The Aziz Habib told my mother, and my mother was very drawn to my father, but she also felt that, I have all this responsibility here in this country. I can't possibly leave all this and just get up and go to another country. That's not possible. And besides, what sort of a proposal is this? I get it out of the blue, and then he rushes off into the war. This is So he went to prison camp really worried about this person that he had met, and how much he had come to feel for her. And my mother realized that in the short time, it was only the 3rd time that they had met before she got his proposal. And my mother was also very drawn to him, but she kind of said, she was very practical. She said, no way, it doesn't make sense. So it was only when my father returned from prison camp, because every so often there was an exchange of prisoners, of
repatriation.
Those who were, those who were really sick or badly wounded, and there was an exchange of prisoners, back and forth. And in April of 43, my father was put in charge of a group of prisoners who were sent back on the Gradiska, the hospital ship, and he had till then had no idea how he was ever going to contact my mother again, if he was ever going to be able to, till the war ended, ever going to be able to get to Egypt. And then here he was on a hospital ship. They berthed in Smyrna in Turkey, and he was on his way to Port Said. So the first thing he did when he landed was, they were debriefed, and then he handed over his wounded contingent, and he hopped onto a truck. He got his pass for Cairo, and he hopped onto a truck and went and knocked on my mother's door. And she almost passed out when she saw him, because she had heard, she knew what had happened in the desert, and that there was a complete fiasco, and the British had been given a really good drubbing, and had lost the battle. And Cairo had been in a complete turmoil. It was called Ash Wednesday because the British embassy had been burning all their files and everything, because the Germans were at the door, at Cairo's door. And she suddenly saw him standing there, and she couldn't believe her eyes. And my father was waiting for a convoy to take him back to India, and he had just those few weeks in Egypt. And he told my mother, he said, "Look, just let me at least spend this time with you." And so they slowly got to know each other. And he told my mother, he said, "Just bring the whole family. Come with your sons, with your and your daughter, and I will take care of we'll be a family together." But the boys, the two boys had already been taken by their father way before my father appeared on the scene. They were living with their father, and it was only the little girl who was living with my mother, and her mother. And my grandmother said to my mother, I do worry about you, because I'm getting old, and I don't know what's going to happen to you once I go. And I've always wanted to go and spend time with my brother in Kamishli in Syria. And this man will make you a good husband and a good father to your daughter, my granddaughter. And eventually my mother capitulated. My father convinced my mother, and so she agreed to marry him. And he immediately went, and he ordered 2 rings, and he inscribed the date that she had agreed to marry him on the rings, and those were their wedding rings eventually. And I've still got the wedding rings. I wear them.
You wear them,
every
yeah?
day.
You told me, yeah, amazing.
Yes, I wear them every day. They're with me. And then, of course, my father had to get on go by convoy back to India, and then to the Burma front. He had to go to the Burma front and to the war there. And my mother was left behind. This is a picture of them when eventually my mother and she's my sister to all intents and purposes. I was, I think, 13 years old before I realized that she was my half sister. As far as I was concerned, she was my sister. And my mother and my sister Violette got on a Greek cargo ship. My father made all the arrangements. He eventually got through his mother, he got my grandfather to agree. My grandmother kind of soft soaped my grandfather, and my grandfather agreed to sponsor my mother and my sister, and they got on this Greek cargo ship, and they got to India. And my father, of course, was on Burma front at the time. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of, those are my father's medals, and that's his military cross. On his way back from the the prison camp on the hospital ship, he met two people. He met a young British a gunner, a bombardier, Harry Brown, who came up to my father and he said, "Sir, I don't know if you remember me, but you took off my arm during the war, and you saved my life by doing that. And you saw me." My father later on, after that, they were taken from the front lines to an Italian medical station. And my father found this bombardier in the sun, begging for water. And my father was so upset about this. He had a couple of sips left in his canteen, and he gave them to this soldier. And the soldier remembered this, and he reminded my father. He said, "You remember, you gave me the last of your water." And my father was so pleased to see that he had survived, in spite of everything. And while they were talking, a British colonel with a kind of a limp and a cane came up to my father and introduced himself as Colonel Llewellyn, and he said, "I've been on the lookout for you because I was told that you were on board." And my father was kind of a little taken aback, and he said, "Really, sir?" So he said, "Yes, I was in camp with your colonel, Colonel Whelans, and he has put you up for a military cross." And my father said, "Are you sure you haven't made a mistake?" And he said, "No." He was very proud of what you did in the war, and you had the chance to escape, but you realized that if you escaped, a lot of your patients wouldn't survive, and so you gave the other doctor and the medical orderlies the chance to escape, and you stayed behind and became a prisoner of war, and you saved many, many lives, and he has put you up for the military cross." And my father was he never told us why he got the military cross. I knew he got it, but whenever we asked him, he said, "Well," he said, I really don't know. I had a job to do. I did it, and they gave it to me." It was only afterwards when I met the two officers in England, and I also got, I was given the history of the regiment, the 2-4 Gurkhas, their regimental history, and I used it as a Bible while writing this book, and that's how I found out why my father was given this cross. So it was, when that was the story of the military cross. And anyway, when my mother and my sister Violette got to Bombay, that was another adventure that they went through. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the SS Fort Stikine and the explosion that took place in the Bombay harbor.
Right. Yeah.
Well, my mother and my sister landed just outside Bombay when that explosion took place. And it caused complete devastation. And they were out in the streets for a good few days waiting for the docks to be cleared. Um, and and eventually they landed. They were there they arrived on the 14th of April, but they landed on the 20th. And 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 eventually, when my father got back from the Burma front just in time to meet her in Calcutta, and that's how they eventually got together.
I mean, it's yeah, and we should remind people you've only given people a part of the story. I mean, it's a big book, folks. I thoroughly recommend you get it and dive in. And I want to finish with the photos you include at the end of the memorial here, because clearly the war changed your father. It brought about great happiness, and eventually he's got a marriage and he's got a family, but also the fact he lost people along the way he served alongside. So just talk about the memorial and the photos we're looking at now.
Well, this is the memorial garden, the Fourth Gurkha Regiment Memorial Garden in a place called Stoke Poges in Buckinghamshire, and that's my father's name at the top.
Yeah.
And then the third name down from my father's, R.N.D. Williams, is Robert Williams. And on the other side, the second name down was N.Q. Brown. That was Ben Brown.
Yeah.
And those were the two officers that I also met in England. They were the last two officers left alive. My father, a little bit of a strange story. My father left Cairo, and 9 months later, my mother followed him to India. And in 2001, my father passed away in January of 2001. And 9 months later, my mother followed him from this world into the next, which was really a strange little quirk, but it was funny how there was just 9 months in both instances. But my father is the only one of two Indian officers whose names are in that memorial garden. It's in the garden of a church.
Yeah.
In Stoke Poges, and I don't know if anybody knows of. Well, anyway, that's a different story. But yes, that's the memorial garden there, and I went and visited it, and it was very moving.
Well, very moving has been what your presentation has. I warned you in advance there might be lots of questions. There's actually been virtually none, because everyone's just been engrossed by it. I think there were a couple of questions. One of the ones I think I'd like to just deal with is how did it work? I know your father was attached to a Gurkha regiment, but how did it work with food and religions? Because within the Indian Army, you've got Hindus and Muslims, and there's different dietary requirements. Did that ever affect how your father was able to work on things with that? Obviously they try to divide people up by caste and religion, and there was a certain amount of requirements, but was that something your father talks about?
Yes, and that brings up another story. Yes, the Gurkhas had a different kitchen, and they like Hindus, they did not eat beef.
Yeah.
My father did, although he was a Hindu, he did. But the Gurkhas were still strict non-beef eaters, so they were in they had a different kitchen. On the way to when they left India on board ship, there was a little bit of a fiasco, because the ship's cooks didn't know anything about their what they ate and what they didn't, and their religion. That was sorted out. But battalions and regiments that catered to the Indians and the Muslims were separate. They knew about their what they were allowed, what they were not allowed. But this brings up a story about one of the rub-ups that my father had was once in the officers' mess, and it was about food. And after that, my father, he got while they were on board, his orderly Dil Bahadur used to always bring. He took my father under his wing, and he felt that my father would appreciate the Indian cooking from the men's, what they call the men's langar, the men's kitchen, and he used to bring my father food, and my father enjoyed it, and he was very, very grateful to him. And because of that, he didn't very often go to the mess. He would eat from the men's kitchen. Ben Brown, while they were in Persia, had gone to my father about something, and they had decided, a few of the officers had decided that they were going to visit a nearby town because they had been told about a restaurant there that served very very good kebabs. And Ben had gone to my father about something, and then he just out of curiosity, he asked my father. He said, "You hardly eat with us in the mess. Has it got anything to do with your religion?" And my father, for a minute, and then he kind of burst out laughing because it was so ironic. The reason why he had a rub up with in the mess with one of the British officers, and he'd kind of steered clear, and he thought, this is so funny because it's got nothing to do with my religion. It's got to do with the mores and the etiquette of mess conduct, that was kind of alien to my father, and he felt, I don't have to put up with this. So yes, there was that, but the army was, the British Indian Army was very well, very well organized when it came to the food.
And yes. I think that's what the people will enjoy about your book is that your father had this unique perspective of being kind of within it, but also outside of it. So many books written about the Gurkhas and Indians were by the white, truly British officers, and your father kind of straddles those worlds, and so therefore, as an officer within the Royal Army Medical Corps, he's kind of brushing shoulders with the British officers, but he's also experiencing it from the point of view of the men he's treating as well. And in just what you've been talking about tonight, it reads like a travelogue because the amount of countries that your mother and your father passed through was incredible. But we will bring the things to end there because it's been fantastic to just talk to you. And folks, as I said earlier, the link to the website is in the description below. I urge you to find the book via whatever source you want. But right now, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us, Leila. It's been fantastic listening to you, and I wish you every success with the book because it gives us such a different perspective on the war that we feel we know the war, but we always need more. We need more viewpoints. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for bringing it to us.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone thank you to everyone who's listening in.
Brilliant. Well, folks, I'll be back again tomorrow. We're back with the second part of our story about the 7th Armored Division in Ardennes. But in the meantime, thanks, everybody, and I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodhouse from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.